So hi, Paul, and a massive welcome to Learning at Large.
Thanks, Kirsty.
Great to have you with us today, and we're going to be diving in and talking about how you've been approaching driving up impact, and also what that really means when you've got those tricky frontline workers, right, that organisations have and make up most of the workforces. How you can really engage them to help drive results. But first, if it's okay, I'll just ask you to do a bit of an introduction of yourself and
Sure.
what your role is. Thanks.
Yeah, so Paul Kent, I lead functional development at PepsiCo. I've been in the organization for over 23 years, based in Cork, Ireland. Originally came into work in quality, in our quality lab, and had careers in research and development, and now in HR and part of our people function and in our PepsiCo University learning team.
All right, well, let's get started. I like to start with some quick fire questions just to kind of, I guess, tease out what we might dive into as we go into the podcast. But obviously, you've been leading learning at PepsiCo for quite a while now, 23 years, I think, or even a little bit more than that. Um, I'm interested in what still gets you out of bed in the morning and passionate about what you do in your role.
Yeah, I suppose, for me, it's helping people do their jobs better today than they did yesterday, right? So, stuff that we do really matters. We're bringing happiness and joy to people's lives through the products that we have and that they consume, and helping people to make those products better, definitely is a motivator for me. And when you're changing, people's decisions that they make on a job, in some cases, you're looking at protecting people's welfare and making sure that we send our products out that are safe, stable, and legal. Coming in and building learning around that is usually beneficial to me and to the organization, and definitely motivates me.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's really great. And if you had to describe what good workplace learning looked or felt like in just 3 words, I know that's quite cruel, but what would you say?
Um, this was relevant, practical, applied.
Nice, I like that, and that's connected to the other ones. Okay, and then another slightly mean one, but it gets us started. So to finish this sentence, what do you think the key factors are that make the difference between a project that changes outcomes and one that doesn't?
For me, it's the clear business intent, right? Real practice and then accountability beyond the classroom. That learning just doesn't stop in the classroom. That is an event that goes beyond that.
Okay, excellent, good answer. And what kind of myths do you think people hold around kind of ROI and impact within L&D that, or maybe even the organisation at large, that can kind of hold people back from driving real change?
Yeah, I think the biggest one I always hear is that you can't really measure our outcomes. You can't measure what we do. And people's starting point often with learning is, oh, it's very hard to measure an outcome from what our challenge is or what our product is. Um, I think they point to sales being an example of what sales is easy because if you train people, they'll sell more. But even the salespeople come back and tell you, oh, it's very difficult now to see how a learning intervention is going to provide an outcome for us. So that to me is the biggest myth because it's for me it's a way of avoiding setting the outcome from the start, which is crucial if you're going to build a learning program.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm sure we're going to unpick this a little bit as we go through the podcast. So help me help us set the scene, I guess, for the listeners. So there's lots of different kinds of learners that you have to serve at PepsiCo, and I imagine some varying challenges given that. Can you kind of help paint a picture of who it is that you're working for, I guess?
Yeah, I mean we everyone is the honest answer. So we serve everyone from our frontline all the way through to our senior executives. Um, and our learning population is huge, have very different needs, have very different outcome focuses, and have very different learning learning knowledge and learning capabilities. They're coming from different areas in the business.
And we know that leadership programs, I think, just across organizations often get huge budgets. But what about the kind of the frontline workers that you work with or work, or serve, I guess? What are the particular challenges do you think with reaching them and kind of initiating learning and development?
Yeah, I think the fact that as an audience type, and quite stereotypically, I suppose, on this one, right? Because not all learners are the same, but from a frontline point of view, you're dealing with an audience of doers versus theoretical thinkers or, or knowledge workers in an organization. So with an audience like that, you need to be very focused on the doing part of it. You need to be very focused on this outcome first, outcome driven approach. Which, by the way, you do with all learners. You need to focus on the outcome first, but the frontline learner especially is going to learn more by doing. So you need to create an environment where they get to practice, where they get to do it, and where it's relevant to their job and it's solving a problem versus theoretical classroom work, which in some cases for a knowledge worker is quite beneficial.
Mm. Okay, that's interesting. Have you got any examples that you can think of to bring to light to kind of show how you've gone about that, or things that didn't work? Where have you learnt this from?
Yeah, I suppose I go back, and a big learning for me early in my career was going into a classroom where we had 30 frontline workers who were sitting in the classroom learning the theory of packaging and learning about burst testing and how our packages can explode under pressure. Um, and they were doing that in an environment that didn't suit what they do day to day. So having them in a classroom and watching them watch slides and watching them watch videos was big learning for me to say, well, we need to take them out of the classroom. So absolutely framing up the theory of why something happens, explaining, look, this is what you're going to do, but without you having the actual opportunity to do it is limited in value. So, one of the things that worked for me is we started bringing our learners to where the work was being done, and working the flow of learning. And what I mean by that is bringing a work scenario or a work challenge into the learning environment and testing the theory against that actual challenge. So it meant with those 30 frontline workers, going down to the equipment and doing the learning at the equipment, having them see and experience the challenges that they were having or the solutions that were there in the moment, versus the theoretical element of it. So that was a big learning for me and a big win for how we changed how we do learning in PepsiCo.
If it's okay to ask a follow up question to that, then
Yeah,
one of the things we often hear is that, particularly with frontline workers, which is a weird term really, that's most of most of the employees, are fit that bill, working on the front line in organisations like yours. But yeah, how much time do they really have to learn day to day, week to week, and how can technology play a part in that as well? I guess.
yeah. I mean, they don't have time. Is the honest answer. Lots of people don't have time. It's not
Mm.
that's not isolated to frontline workers. Where it becomes a bigger challenge for our front line is that their leadership don't perceive them having the time. So, if we were doing a 3-day program, which we used to do for many years, in a classroom and taking, frontline workers off the floor and bringing them into a classroom for 3 days, there's a hesitation to do that because the question is, well, what's the value? I'm losing my workforce for 3 days. Um, so it's going to be a huge challenge. The use of technology, I mean, if you have the right outcome that you define at the start, if you have the right intention for how you're going to build the learning, technology can be a great scaling tool. But technology is not the answer. So, when it's a scaling tool, we've seen its use for example, we use podcasts in some parts of the industry for drivers or fleet who, we can't bring them into a classroom, so we can use technology to get to them in their environment, right? So, we can see technology as a use for that, but it becomes a scaling tool rather than the solution to the whole problem. Um, but in many cases, it's the outcome and the intention that you start with that shows the value. So you're going to get that buy-in from the leadership of those frontline workers if you can show the value of actually delivering the learning and being efficient about it. So maybe now moving from a 3-day in-person classroom course to having some technology solutions, maybe some online work that will frame it, that reduces the time away from the equipment, away from the front line. Well, you still need that human interaction and that support.
Mm. Okay, great. And you've mentioned it a couple of times there, the importance of getting the leadership on board, and perhaps it's their perception of, for example, learning time that can sometimes maybe make blockers that may or may not really be there. But what have you done, I guess, to engage those frontline managers and leaders that work in those kind of departments, and is it actually learning and development for them that is the key in the first place?
Yeah, yeah. Um, Making them part of the conversation is critical. You know, like people do things because their leaders ask them to do it, not because the L&D person asked them to do it. So targeting the frontline manager is critical if you want to get buy-in, and getting their support. So making them part of the development of the solution. Okay, what are your challenges? How is it linked to your business challenges? How is it going to link to your outcomes? How are you going to see your value? So, in some cases, taking their advice for building what you're doing
Mm.
is critically important, and then equipping the frontline leaders with the knowledge of what this is, because I often see, one-to-one meetings that managers are having, and they're ill-equipped. They don't know how to have a one-to-one meeting. In some cases, they're not having them at all. If you can give them a toolkit, if you can give them the information that's going to make them shine, right, to their employees, it's going to create more value. So once you've got their buy-in, I see all the time, people who go on programs under the recommendation of their manager. In some cases, we bring the manager in, and if we're emailing out an invite to a learning event, we copy the manager on that email. We make them aware of it. We ask them to have a conversation with their employee about the outcomes of it, and then we loop back around afterwards, and we look for feedback, and we look at were there observed behaviors by the manager of the associate of the employee.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for walking us through that. And
Nice.
kind of made you kind of go deep into kind of frontline, just because that's kind of where we got to in the kind of initial part of the conversation. But obviously, you said that's not just who you work with or for. Um, have you got other examples of the kind of learning approaches you've taken with other people in the organisation that you might like to bring to light, and seen where that drives impact as well?
Yeah, I think we've got various audiences within the organization, and we've looked at different ways of learning. If I look at what I inherited, it was a lot of e-learning, right? A lot of people learning on their own, um, you know, on-demand learning. We see how life is often mimicked in learning, right? So we have this kind of Netflix thinking of on-demand learning, where people could take something if they wanted. They were a curious learner. In reality, that's some work. We're time poor. So for every learner in the organization, we target them. We link it to our global job architecture, the skills and proficiencies for every role that they need, and we give them targeted learning. So rather than saying you can learn whatever you want, which you can go and be intellectually curious. And I think it's about a 3% uptake of that across the organization. What we found is that when we're more targeted about it, and when we link it to outcomes and we show success, that we're getting more value from the learning. And I go back to saying, like with any learner, when we start with the outcome in mind and work towards that, we'll know when we got there. I don't get in the car and just start driving without knowing the destination. I know my destination, so I'll know successes when I get there. So
Mm.
we set that outcome from the very start for the learner. We don't necessarily tell them that that's the destination they're going to. We bring them along the journey as normal, but we know success because we will get that final destination. And what we found is that it's different learners learn in different ways. So the old model of overwhelming people with lots of technology around e-learnings didn't really work. But when we bring in things like cohort learning, when we bring in animations, videos, and simulations as another avenue for learning, and we combine our methodologies, we see more success. So now I'm learning on my terms. I'm learning with whatever way suits me, with different modalities, giving me a similar, if not the same message through all of them. But most importantly, and I mentioned simulations, most important that we're giving people time to practice what they've learned.
Mm.
And that's true of so many audiences. If there isn't a practical element to it, we really have to question why we're doing it. And in some cases, that means that we have cohorts learning together, doing like we had last week, a program where we had people working on a P&L together, a large group, and getting experience. But the outcome of it was they had to do a P&L, and that mimics what they need to do in their job. So if we can make it close to reality, that's the win for us.
So you think it's that combination of obviously aligning the learning to skills and outcomes in the first place, which you bring the employees on that journey to understand that connection as well. That combination of that plus the change in modalities and kind of the uplift of cohort learning and that kind of social learning aspect as well as application. That was kind of like the sweet spot that you found, or you're finding at the moment anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, brilliant point, right? Finding at the moment, because that will change as well, and that will evolve over time. And, the ways that technology is growing, and, that what we're seeing as changes in learning is impacting what we do. But at the moment, that is the sweet spot for us.
And how did you said that you could tell that people got there, they got to the outcomes. You know, what did that look like? So you mentioned that you might have mapped the learning to a skill. You might have to think of an example here, but how would a certain skill show up? Like, how did you know that someone had like, yeah, they've done it, they've got it?
The key for us was bucketing out, what are the groupings of outcomes we wanted. So are we looking for an ROI, a measurable number? Is it a compliance outcome? Is it a, risk avoidance? Are we going to make sure that our products are safe? And once we categorized what we were trying to get to, once we got to defining what that meant, having a smart objective around what the outcome was, and then working back, and we work back from outcomes, then we look at something like Kirkpatrick model and say, okay, now how we're going to measure this, right? So talk to Kirkpatrick Institute, they'll tell you that in the four levels of learning, start with level four, start with your results. When you're building it, and then measure from level one. So as we measured, and I think a lot of L&D functions do this, right? We get bogged down in measuring the level one, maybe a little bit of the level two stuff, and we say, well, it's very hard to measure level three, level four. It's not, but it's hard because you don't set that destination. So when it becomes measurable, we measure the reaction to it because it is important. How do people feel about the learning? But then we evolve to measuring, well, okay, what did they learn? Did they learn something? Is there something they can demonstrate to us that they've learned? And demonstration is important, right? So if I do that simulation, is there an observable behavior? And as we move into those behavior changes, it's when observed by an independent party, their manager, their team leader, a peer, um, and then did we get the result we intended to? And sometimes people confuse the behavior with the result, right? So, I talked to a customer services team. And they said, well, we need our teams to have better empathy to do what? So we need you to extend your thinking there to say, well, what will better empathy do? Will it result in returning customers? Will it result in our CSAT scores going up? And it was, so yes, and right. So it's measuring at every level and understanding, did we eventually get to our outcome? And then if we didn't get to our outcome, resetting. And sometimes we get to a different outcome. Sometimes, the outcome we actually intended, yes, we met that, but there was a byproduct of another outcome that we hadn't even thought about, which when we go back and we review our training, we say, okay, well, that's now an outcome for the training as well.
Okay, excellent. I love that example because you obviously talked about the context around the skills, which is so important, and the application, i.e., the tasks that somebody will have to do. Especially because we're hearing about all the big skill gaps, like things like critical thinking, for example, systems thinking are some of the big ones that organisations across the globe are deemed to be lacking and need to be working on. But what that looks like, in different contexts, it hugely varies. And so, yeah, that linking to tasks is really important, right, in every case. Yeah. That's great. Thank you for that. And you mentioned AI simulations a moment ago, which I'm keen to kind of pick your brains on. So tell me about those. Like, where have you kind of used them? Where have you found traction? And what was even going on in them? How do they work?
Yeah, I think, I recently said this on LinkedIn. People think that AI simulations are new. They're not. I mean, we go back to the 1920s, 1930s, and pilots are using flight simulators to practice their jobs. So this is old wine in new bottles in many ways. And the context is quite simple here. We can't always practice. And this was, when I led food safety and quality training, one of the things that I realized was you can't really have an allergen outage in the real world. You can't practice, somebody putting an allergen into a product because it's dangerous, right? But how can we simulate that happening? And this goes back to, before we started really using simulations, we were using VR headsets to show an allergen spill and a cleanup and stuff like that, right? But now as we move in, I mean, the power of AI is becoming huge. Um, we think of things like negotiation, where I can now negotiate with a counterpart who looks like that counterpart, who sounds like that counterpart, who will behave like that counterpart because we have access in the background to their P&L statements. So we know what the break point was for negotiation previously. So we're practicing something that's real. So on a Friday, I can practice with what looks like the person I'm going to be negotiating with on a Monday. And it's going to be very close to realistic. I can change their behavior. I can say, let's make them defensive, let's make them positive, let's make them agreeable. So we're giving people real skills that they're going to use and practice in that moment and in that way. Um, and the other part is that translation strategy is huge in a multinational organization. They can do that in their own language. They can do that to suit them. Accessibility for anyone who has vision or hearing problems, we can modify the program to meet their needs and to meet them where they are. And the simulators have replaced having someone to practice with. So in the organization, if you wanted to practice your negotiation, you had maybe a human coach and you did that. And we still do that, by the way. It's not that we completely removed that, but now the human coaches are setting the context and the parameters within the AI so that people can scale up and we can educate 200 people with that one human coach. And we set the parameters in there, and the human coach can check for outages and can provide support beyond that. If there's a goal level of support that's needed and someone has questions, they're no more impactful. But the transactional day-to-day stuff in the negotiation, which is same for everyone, and the repeatability can be managed by technology.
Mm. That's interesting. And did you start with those kind of areas where it is harder to practice in real life? Like, for example, I used to work with the police. We did a lot of simulations because, I work with the counterterrorism department, for example, to do simulations. You're going to do that through technology, right? In the first place, to bring people up to speed. You mentioned like you don't want to do allergen testing in real life, or playing around with that, or there's different simulations where machines might break, or the factory might have some kind of error or something like that. Did you start there and then work out where to bring the humans in other areas, or did you start with kind of more of the kind of coaching side where actually people could argue, hey, it seems like you're replacing humans here?
Yeah, we started with the problems, um, and we started with humans. We started by, if we ran a training session, we put groups in four corners of the room, and a human would coach them. Um, it's interesting you say, the fear that people would have, well, now I'm being replaced by technology, versus now we're going to scale up using technology. So we started using the tools that better suited our needs. So we still have the same amount of humans doing that work. It's just that they're doing different work.
Mm.
They're educating the tool, they're building the parameters, they're checking for outages, and they're managing the reports and the outcomes versus the repeatable coaching. Um, so in a lot of ways, we started with the problem. We started with how we fixed the problem. I mean, the early days of us doing this were decision tree type simulations, right? Would you do A, B, or C? Would you do A, B, or C? And going through, and yes, you've made the right choices, which had some impact. But now, we're putting our values on top of AI, and we're testing out new ways of being more efficient. So rather than replacing the human with the technology, we're upskilling the human to manage the technology, and actually giving them more value add tasks than repeating the same coaching conversation and script over and over again.
Yeah, more of the icing on the cake rather than having to keep
Yeah.
making the cakes every day. Yeah. Okay. And when you came to kind of bring in these, I guess they started with experiments rather than kind of big projects. I don't know. They're keen to hear. But who did you have to convince in the organisation? Did you have to? And did you have to get data on your side to help kind of then go from an experiment to a scale up?
Yeah, I mean, the convincing one was a little bit easier because we had been doing large scale classroom events that were taking a week that people were traveling into. So now when we're having conversations saying, well, actually, you know what, we're going to reduce down the in-person element of this to, a day and a half from a week. But we're going to need people to have their simulation done, have their experience done. So, buy-in from that point of view was easier. Um, but still, learning has a bad reputation because sometimes when learning is done, it's done with a view of, well, I need to get this many hours of learning done or these many completions done, and it's not about the outcome. So a lot of our convincing that we had to do was around linking to business outcomes. Okay, so what business outcome are we solving, and what will it look like? And showing success. If we're if we're talking about bringing people into a negotiation training, well, we've got to record a negotiation for the organization and demonstrate where we showed value. Was that an increase in quality? Was it a decrease in cost? And that's linked to, well, what did we say day one was our destination? What did we want to achieve by this? That's why I say it's critically important to start with the outcome in mind and work back from that. So once you're linking to the business outcome, and once you can demonstrate success in that, you get support. And if the business outcome is, well, we want us to minimize downtime of our line as we're making our product and increase the speed of a changeover of flavors. Well, the business understands that. Um, you know, personal one for me is when I came in and as an L&D group, we were measuring net promoter score and we were measuring, scores out of 5 on how learning performed, and that was our measure, right? And that's what we were hanging our hat on. Nobody was measuring, well, did we achieve the business outcome? And that's what the business cares about. I promise you that the business doesn't really care about a net promoter score or how people felt about the learning. They care about, well, what was the outcome? Did we,
Mm.
did we save money? Did we avoid risk?
On a practical front, how do you find out like about the business goals? Like you've already mentioned skills, right? How do you know what skills the business needs? Where do you go to get that? Or is it a conversation? Is it a document? Is it a quarterly meeting? What is it? What's going on?
Yep. So our talent management team, we have an amazing talent management team, and it's about understanding that L&D can't do everything on their own. So within our people function, the talent management team have done a global job architecture. We changed all this September 2025. We released this to the organization, and we've linked every job family with its job subfamilies underneath it, which then has capabilities, skills, and proficiencies, right? So taking a Josh Bersin framework and putting it into reality. So we maintain what are the current and future skills that we need for every job family and subfamily in our organization. What it looks like is there's typically up to 10 hard skills, up to 10 soft skills. So 20 things at varying proficiency levels that we need you to do that job. Um, and very importantly, if you want a different career, change your career, and you like another role, you're now doing it on an evidence-based approach, right? So you can now compare, well, I'm interested in this job in sales. I currently work in procurement. What's the gap between my current role and that role? And you get a matching, right? Almost, you're a 67% match for this. And
Mhm.
in order to close the gap, you need to have this element of learning, these experiences, because it's not all just about learning. It might be that I need to build experiences within the organization, build knowledge of another region or sector. So we have a full database of every single role from uh, outside Frontline will be done this year. So every single salaried role in the organization up to, I think, up to VP now at this point, it's done with Frontline Learning to be next. So like, and even as we look at Frontline Learning, an equipment technician makes salary A, but the packaging equipment engineer makes salary A plus 20, right? So if I want to upscale and career path through, I now have an evidential based approach to it rather than gut feeling of, I think that this person might be right for this job. It's now evidenced by the skills and knowledge that you have.
And presumably there's humans in the loop with that, right? So there's data coming from databases in various systems, but you've still got the human performance reviews going on.
Absolutely. Every output is reviewed by a human.
Hmm.
Um, so, as we're coming in and AI will tell us certain things. It will tell us, well, these are future trends of work, right? This is the hype cycle for skills and capabilities that are coming into this organization. But there's a human reviewing that for sanity. It's so, if we look at the roles of the future, it's really important to say, well, is that logical? Do we really think that that's going to be a skill that people will need into the future? Um, and then as we build learning plans, it's humans that are reviewing the learning plan. Now, the scalability of it means that there is some AI intervention to say, well, here I know all your needs, which you've gathered, vetted, and reviewed. Over here, I know the full ecosystem of learning, some things that you didn't even know we had. And it does a mapping of, well, does this element solve this outcome? But it's still the human that says yes or no.
Hmm.
If you look at, a tool like Copilot, if I get on the plane, yes, there's a Copilot. There's also a pilot, right? So it's the human working with technology.
Yeah. Same approach to your learning, right? So you've got that combination there, and then right
Yeah,
through the kind of talent management system. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that the brain power, the thinking, the strategy is coming from the human. The how, the logic, the scalability is coming from the technology.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. And what would be your advice, do you think, for others working in L&D, or maybe those in smaller teams who are looking to embrace, I guess, smarter uses of tech or more alignment to business objectives? Where do you think they should start? Like, what would you recommend?
Yeah, start narrow. Start with one small business problem to solve, and solve it all the way through. Um, don't be the nail going around looking for the hammer. Go with one solution. Um, have an outcome, and I mentioned earlier the business outcome is going to be critical. Why is this important to the business? And see that all the way through, and then scale it, and then scale your thinking to say, okay, well, I'm going to use that approach of bringing in the right tech for the right time, um, and scale it up. But to go all the way to the end first. We talk a lot about learning, having a seat at the table with the business. Well, you've got to earn that seat at the table. You've got to earn that by proving value. You've got to earn it by showing that what I'm delivering is going to make meaningful sense to the business, um, and then celebrate your success. Right, go and sing from the rooftops of learning this, because what I do find is that when learning is a solve in the outcome, um, people are slow to give credit to the learning teams who built it and the learning strategy behind it. And they say, well, we'd have done that anyway. It's not learning. It was because we had better engineers or we had better equipment. Um, and we would have negotiated that price anyway. We don't know what would have happened if you didn't put learning in. But so celebrate your success and claim, even if it's a percentage, right? I'm not going to say that learning is going to solve everything and is going to be the only one. But if you started with the outcome and you've worked back, then it's easier to say, well, we know what learning did to get us there because that's the outcome we wanted to get to. We started with it. Sometimes I find without starting with the outcome, people will run a learning program and then ask the question, what do we think got better? And nobody knows what got better because we didn't set the destination day one.
I mean, it's always going to be a correlation, right? Because it's a collaborative approach. So it's never like a one-to-one causation of like, because of the learning, then the business changed the needle went up by 50% as a direct result. So I think it's accepting that correlative approach, right? Because you're going to be doing it with the leaders, with other approaches. They might be looking at processes improvements and other things as well, right? But I think sometimes, I don't know what you think, the L&D can get maybe worried that there needs to be a kind of causation, on the big goals, and actually that's not how things work, right?
But that's why L&D then go and fall back on things like net promoter score and marks and feelings in that reaction realm, and almost um, lose the idea that there has to be a correlation to a business outcome, right?
Mm.
But it's easier if I'm a learning person. It's easier for me to bamboozle you with net promoter score
You can
and
own it, right? That's your
yeah,
corner. Yeah, no one
L&D.
else can touch it. Yeah.
And the thing is, the business, while they may not understand this, they don't really necessarily care about it either. And then even as we talk about, causation versus correlation, sometimes you're going to have outcomes that is avoidance, right? That you've reduced risk or eliminated risk. And, if we look at having better food safety in our product, well, an outcome of learning is not doing damage, not
Hmm.
injuring somebody or causing an illness or food poisoning. It's very hard to measure something that didn't happen.
Hmm.
And what I've always said to the food safety team is, well, if we're not teaching people the right way of doing things, if we stopped, what would happen? If
Hmm.
we didn't educate people that you've got to use a food grade lubricant on the line, um, what would happen? And the risk to us is enormous. Reputation and
Yeah.
brand damage.
It's about playing your role as a steward of the culture as well, though, right? Because if you've got a safety culture, you're playing a role in it, and you have to maintain that. So, yeah, I've worked a lot in kind of oil and gas, where safety is obviously key, and yeah, that it's your role in the big cultural play. It's making sure you're maintaining. You have to keep your wheel spinning because you can't afford for one of them to drop, right? Because that's where risk rises.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
brilliant. So let's take a step back. Then I'm going to ask you some. I was going to say fun questions. It depends what you think. Wrap up questions, maybe I should call them. But looking ahead, then, what tech innovation or change really excites you at the moment in the world of L&D?
Um, I don't know if it's anything, future coming because we don't know. We
Hmm.
don't know what's coming, but I think it's the scaling of the use of the existing technologies that excites me is, you know, using tech and AI to understand, well, what is the problem that's out there. I'm really interested in things like drone deliveries of products, right? So in the US now, you can get I think they're calling it the ice cream test, where you can have a drone delivery of your groceries within 15 minutes of order, right? So doing things faster excites me. Seeing what's out there that's just evolving. I'm seeing a lot of robotics in facilities um, and how we organize our warehouses using robotics. That's really interesting. Um, Although again, we've got to be careful that there's still human involvement in that and that we've got oversight of that as well. But yeah, so I honestly, there's probably something coming that I don't even know about. And that's probably the most exciting part is, if we look back 5 years and how we were using AI versus now, it's in a different world altogether. And we've democratized AI for everyone and everyone's using it.
Mm.
What would we be doing next?
Yeah, I like your answer because it's more about the changes that are going on in the wider world or in the workplace, rather than it just being a change within like L&D, because those things all connect, right? And it's the
Yeah.
changing nature of how people are working, who's doing the work, if it's tech, humans, that will drive the changes, I guess, in the way that we use technology and learning. So, yeah. If you had a magic wand that could do anything, again, let's keep it within the remit of L&D if we can this time, then what would you do?
Um, Probably close the gap between learning and productivity and learning and business outcomes. Um, I think for me, getting L&D people to stop being order takers. So the message that sounds like, please give me a 10-minute e-learning that's going to teach everyone everything they need to know about our business and give it to me in 21 languages. It goes back to the Henry Ford quote, if I ask them what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses, right? So we have to get away from the business telling us our job. So the magic one would have L&D people saying, please come to with your business outcome. Start with your business challenge, your business need, your business outcome, and let me do my job.
Hmm.
Let me do my job to get the right learning, to understand who the people are, to work with the right partners in my organization, like my talent management team, like my talent acquisition teams, to build you targeted learning for that audience.
Great, thanks. And what do you think that learning leaders out there should kind of double down on this year if they really want to move beyond learning to real performance?
Making sure that their voice is heard at the table and showing value. And one that I said earlier, celebrating the success of that outcome uh, with the business, making sure that they're being a good business partner like any other part of the business as we think end to end. Learning has a critical role to play. Learning leaders have a critical part to help the business to understand why they're adding that value.
Nice, brilliant. Well, I'm going to leave it there and say a massive thank you for joining me on Learning at Large today. It's been fantastic to talk to you, and yeah, I could keep going and drill even further into your examples, but I think we'll wait and see where things go next, and love to hear back from you as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
All right,
brilliant.
brilliant. Really appreciate it.